Anyway, I will stop rambling now, and we shall start with some ghost stories. Firstly, The Other Sense by J.S. Fletcher. October the 21st. They have told me today, with obvious reluctance, and in the kindest fashion, that I am to go tomorrow to the house of a Dr. Schreiber, in whose care I am to remain until I am restored to health. Restored to health? My God, I am as healthy a lad of 19, I believe, as anyone would wish to meet. Certainly I have no recollection of any illness beyond a dose of measles when I was 7, and a very slight touch of scarlet fever a few years ago. Restored to health? No, that is merely their kind way of putting it. What they really mean is, I am to go and live with this Dr. Schreiber, whoever he may be, until he, and they, and the doctors whom they have brought to see me so often lately, think I am sane. That, of course, is the real truth. I have often wondered, as I have grown up out of my lonely childhood towards manhood, how strange it is that what seems so easy to the child about truth-telling seems so difficult to the man. Now I am beginning to understand. All the same, it would have been much more to my taste if my guardian and his wife had said to me, "Angus, we're very, very sorry, but the doctors and we don't think everything is as it should be with your intellect, and Dr. Schreiber is a famous mental specialist," and so on. But then, equally, of course, they couldn't have said that to me if they really believe that I am mad. And they do. I know. I have seen them not once but 1,000 times since I came here to London from Altnashiel 2 years ago. When shall I see it again, and the mists on the mountains, watching me as country folk watch the freaks at a fair? There is a puzzled look which comes into their faces, their brows knit, and their lips are slowly compressed or pursed up, and, if they think I do not see them, they look at each other and shake their heads and sigh. I cannot think of more than 3 things which should make them believe me mad. One is that I am very fond of solitude, liking to be left to myself as much as I can. Another is that I think a great deal, just as I read a great deal, and that I sometimes frown at my thoughts, sometimes smile at them, sometimes laugh long and loud at them. Perhaps when Major Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy and I are alone after dinner, he reading the Times and she busied with her knitting, behaviour of this sort on my part may seem strange. It is only now occurring to me that it may. Certainly I have seen the Major drop his newspaper and jump, literally jump, in his armchair when, thinking of something that amused me, I have indulged in a sudden peal of laughter. Yet why should one not laugh whenever one sees or thinks of something to laugh at? But I have found that a great many of the people whom I have met in London only laugh when a sort of signal is given. Those are 2 reasons. The only other reason I can think of is that I have told them once or twice, just as I told the doctors whom they have at times brought to see me, that I can see things, which I find out most other people do not or cannot see. The first time I told them, for instance, of the spirit, which I have seen a score or so of times at Altnashiel, they stared at me as if I were telling them lies, and they both looked curiously uncomfortable. Now, my old nurse, Margaret Lang, never looked uncomfortable when I told her of these things, neither did Dugald Graham, my father's old body servant. They seemed to realise and to understand my meaning. I have been thinking today, since I heard what my guardian and his wife had to tell me, he, poor man, in his stiff military-modelled sentences, and she more by tears than by words, about my life as a child and afterwards as a boy. Altnashiel is in one of the loneliest glens of the Strathern Mountains, a very great way indeed from the railways. There my father, Angus MacIntyre, like myself, went to live just after he was married to my mother, and there my mother died just after I was born. My father was a man of books, and after my mother's death he thought of nothing but books. Margaret Lang, helped by Dugald Graham, brought me up, but after I was able to walk, my real nurse and mother was the open air. I used to sit out, anywhere, all day long, content to see the sky and hear the countryside sounds and smell the heather and the gorse and the bracken. And I cannot remember, looking back, when it was that I did not see things that other people did not see. I was never afraid of anything that I ever saw. I have gone on seeing ever since, now usually at long intervals. When I was 17, my father died, and it was found that Major Kennedy, a distant connection, was to be my guardian, and that I was to live with him until my 21st year. That is why I am now writing this in my journal in my own room in Major Kennedy's house in Bayswater, and why I am tomorrow to take up my residence with Dr. Schreiber at Wimbledon Common. Possibly I am writing it because, for anything I know, this may be my last day of complete liberty. I do not know what the rules are in these private madhouses, if this to which I am going is such a place. If I may speak frankly to myself in these pages, I must say that I cannot see why I should be considered at all mentally afflicted. I am, as things go, fairly well educated. Fond as I am of solitude, I am fond of games, especially of football, golf, and tennis. I am certainly very strong in body, and of rude health. And as for my appetite... However, they say I suffer from occasional delusions. We shall see. Chapter 2. October the 23rd. I came here, to Dr. Schreiber's house, yesterday afternoon, accompanied by Dr. Wilkinson, one of the 2 doctors who have been to see me so often lately. The parting between the Kennedys and myself made me think of the conventional descriptions of boys going to school. Major Kennedy shook hands with me at least 6 times, and Mrs. Kennedy cried. Dr. Wilkinson and I talked football all the way from Bayswater to Wimbledon, and I found out that he got his blue at Oxford. I forget in what year. Just before we got to Wimbledon Common, I thought I would have a little straightforward conversation with Dr. Wilkinson. "Look here, sir," I said. "You, in common with Dr. Gordon and Major and Mrs. Kennedy, think I am a little mad." "I think that a few months' residence with Dr. Schreiber will turn you out as fit as a fiddle," he replied. "Why do most people give an evasive answer when it would be much simpler to tell the truth in one word?" I asked him. "Why don't they?" he answered. "I've often wondered that myself." "Or again," said I, "how is it that people who happen through no fault of their own to possess a certain faculty or certain faculties, which other people, most people, do not possess, are invariably considered to be queer?" He shook his head, and I relapsed into such a profound and cogitative silence that at last he asked me what I was thinking about. "I was thinking, sir," I replied, "how admirably you would have filled the role of those physicians of the Middle Ages who, whenever powerful monarchs or statesmen wanted to get rid of any person inimical to them, were ever ready to testify to their madness and to enclose them within a dungeon or an oubliette or—" "Well, you'll not find Dr. Schreiber's place much of a dungeon, my boy," he said, laughing. "Here we are, so you can see for yourself." I got out of the brougham and looked around me. This house is an old-fashioned structure of red brick, covered over with climbing plants, and it stands in the midst of a bright green lawn, the flower beds and borderings of which are just now cheerful with a profusion of autumn blooms. There is not a suspicion of anything prison-like about it. On the contrary, its appearance suggests freedom and liberty. My first glance at it forced me to set up a comparison between it and Bayswater. Dr. Schreiber came out to meet us. He is a youngish man, perhaps 35, perhaps 40, tall, muscular, broad-shouldered, bronzed and cheery. I should have taken him for one of the sweller sort of professional cricketers rather than for what I was led to believe him, a private madhouse keeper. He welcomed me in a very friendly way, and after Dr. Wilkinson had gone, volunteered to show me round the house and grounds. I was somewhat astonished to find no one about, except servants in the house and a gardener sweeping up fallen leaves on the lawn. "Where, sir," I asked, "are the rest of us?" "The rest of whom?" he inquired, looking surprised. "The rest of your other mad folk," I answered. "I am sent here because they think me mad." He laughed, burst, rather, into laughter, and slapped my shoulders. "Oh, hang all that, old chap," he said. "There's no one here but you, myself, my assistant Pollard, who's a real good sort, and the servants. You're as free as air here, and if I don't give you a first-class time, it won't be my fault." Later we fell to talking about golf. Today, after he had been to visit his patients, he seems to have a pretty extensive practice, we managed to get a full round in before dusk came on. He beat me by 2 up and 1 to play. Chapter 3. October the 27th. I have been very happy here so far, much happier, I believe, nay, am sure, than I have ever been since I left Altnachil. Life is very pleasant in this house, and with Dr. Schreiber. He is very different, I think, to all other men I have ever met. I have been with him frequently to visit some of his poorer patients. It seemed to me that he laughs them out of their complaints. I do not mean that he laughs at them, but that his cheeriness is infectious and lifts them out of themselves. He is certainly a great man, a big human. Last night, after dinner, he and I were playing billiards, and somehow, I do not know how, we reached the question of what those other people call my delusion. We sat down. This was the first time I had ever spoken of it to him, and I told him of some things which I had seen, especially of the ghost, if it is a ghost, of the parish clerk of Ardnashonach. Instead of looking as if he could scarcely believe his ears, as Major Kennedy looks, or shaking his head as Dr. Wilkinson did, he listened most intently and asked me a lot of questions. Not questions about myself, which is what I detest, but sensible questions. "And they aren't delusions, you know," I said at the end. "I have seen these things, seen them. You believe me?" "Yes," he said, "I do. Look here, if you ever see anything while you're here, just come that minute and tell me. Now then, we've time for another 100 before bed." Chapter 4. November the 4th. I have been examining this old house inside and out with some interest since Dr. Schreiber told me a day or 2 ago that it was once, a century or more ago, the residence of a famous statesman. It is, I think, early Georgian, and has the most delightful rooms, many of which are panelled in oak to a considerable height. There is one, now used as a dining room, but formerly the library, which attracts me more than all the rest. It has 4 high, narrow windows overlooking the garden, and with its quaint old oak furniture, which Dr. Schreiber took over from his predecessor in the practice, a man named Turrell, who was, he says, one of the cleverest men of his day, it makes a picture of colour and distinction. There is an old oak long settle near the deep fireplace, in which I shall love to sit when the winter really settles in, if it ever does in this soft-aired sunny south, so different to the far-away north. Chapter 5. November the 17th. Something has happened. That seems a trite enough thing to write down, but the 3 words, after all, mean much, followed by an explanation. The truth is, my curious sense, extra sense, I suppose, has manifested itself again. I believe the last time was 5 years ago, when I saw the fairies near the church of Dalnarossy. Yesterday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, Dr. Schreiber having gone to London and Mr. Pollard to visit a patient across the common, I was alone in the dining room and sitting in the corner of the long settle. There was no light in the room except that of the fire, which had burnt itself down to that clear glow which fires get on sharp, frosty afternoons of late autumn. I had spent most of the time since lunch reading a curious old book which I had found in Dr. Schreiber's study the day before, and was leaning back against the cushions of the long settle with my eyes closed, thinking of what I had read, and enjoying the quiet of the shadowy, scarcely lighted room, when I suddenly felt that I was not alone. The feeling was so strong, so acute, that for a full minute I remained quiescent. At last I opened my eyes, knowing without doubt that I was going to see something. What I saw was this. There stood upon the big, square hearthrug, within a few feet of me, a young man whom I judged to be of about my own age, perhaps a little older. He was tall, he stooped slightly, and he was spare of figure. His attire was modern, a black morning coat and vest and dark striped trousers, and he stood with his hands in his pockets, after the fashion affected by Eton boys, somewhat slouchingly. His head was bent forward, and at first I could not see his face, but he presently turned a little, and the glow of the fire fell on it. I knew then that I was regarding a ghost. The face confirmed in me my belief that this had been, I should say, a young man of, say, 19 years of age. It was a sad, uneasy face, a face whereon were many signs of anxiety, trouble, perplexity, and it was curiously old. It was not a strong face. The chin was small and delicate, the mouth amiable but weak. The eyes, big and blue, were the eyes of a child, and there was a frightened expression in them. I sat perfectly still, watching. The figure remained in an irresolute position, fidgeting on the hearthrug for a minute or so. Then it walked slowly to the window, stood looking out into the garden a while, then came back to the hearthrug, lingered there a minute more, and finally crossed the room and opened the door. I followed it through the doorway on the instant. The servants had already lighted the hall lamp, and the hall was clearly illuminated. And the hall was empty. There was no figure there. I told Dr. Schreiber of all this after we had finished our usual game of billiards last night. He listened with the gravest attention to everything I said, and when I had finished, merely remarked, "Angus, if you should ever see this apparition, or whatever it may be again, do not be afraid to tell me at once." Chapter 6. November the 22nd. I have seen the ghost of the young man again. This afternoon I went out to stroll about the neighbourhood, and in the course of my wanderings turned into Wimbledon churchyard. I was walking aimlessly about the paths, looking at the tombstones and wondering if they had any unusual names or quaint epitaphs upon them, when I suddenly saw the apparition again, standing at the side of a grave which lay at the chancel end of the church. It was attired exactly as before, and stood in a similar fashion, slightly slouching, with its hands in the pockets of its trousers. The face was just as sad and troubled as ever, and had the same air of perplexity. The big, blue, childish eyes turned from the grave to the headstone, and from the headstone to the grave, as if trying to read something on the one or to see something on the other. Then they stared all round the churchyard, wonderingly. I drew nearer and looked at the inscription on the tombstone by which the ghost stood. In fact, I approached to within a few feet of the ghost itself. It seemed to me that it saw me, but only looked at me in the casual, uninterested way in which strangers regard each other. The inscription was short and simple. Here lieth the body of Major General Sir Arthur Debenham, K.C.B., born January the 15th, 1831, died October the 4th, 1892. Also that of Florence Georgiana, his wife, born September the 12th, 1834, died February the 7th, 1893. Also in memory of their only child, Everard, born August the 12th, 1874, died July the 20th, 1893, at Hudiksvall, Sweden, where he is interred. When I looked round again, the apparition had disappeared. I came straight back to Dr. Schreiber's house and happened to catch him just coming in. After I had told him of this second appearance, he remained silent for some time, and at last, without making any comment, asked me to go with him into the garden. He approached the gardener, an oldish man who was at work there before Dr. Schreiber took over the practice. "Gregson," he said, "you've lived a long time about here, haven't you?" "Man and boy, 55 years, sir," replied Gregson. "Did you ever know Major General Sir Arthur Debenham?" "Know the old general, sir? I should think I did. Why, he lived not half a mile from here. I knew 'em all. Why, the young gentleman, poor Mr. Everard, he lived here in this very house with your predecessor, Dr. Turrell, for some months after Lady Debenham died. Dr. Turrell and him was a-travelling on the continent when Mr. Everard died, sir." "What was the matter with him, with Mr. Everard?" "Matter, sir? Why, what I calls a galloping consumption. He was a weak, white-faced lad always, and he got a deal worse after he came to live with the doctor. That was why they went to foreign parts, to see if it would do him any good." "Why did he come to live with Dr. Turrell? Had he no relations of his own that he could go to?" "They did say, sir, that he'd neither kith nor kin. Dr. Turrell had been the old general's doctor, and Lady Debenham's too. He was about the only friend they had hereabouts, sir. They were a bit queer, the old gentleman and his wife. Eccentric, as they term it." "Was the general rich?" Gregson scratched his head. "Well, I should say he was a warm man, sir. Always considered to be so, anyway. Kept his carriage and so on," he answered. After a few more questions, we went away. But I have since been asking more questions of Gregson and of the housekeeper. Their description of Everard Debenham is that of the apparition of the young man whose ghost I have now seen on 2 occasions. Chapter 7. November the 28th. I think that even Major Kennedy will now believe that I possess some curious power of seeing the usually unseen. Yesterday afternoon, at 2 o'clock, Dr. Schreiber, Mr. Pollard and myself were lunching in the dining room when I suddenly saw the ghost enter. It came in very quietly, in its usual half-slouching attitude, and immediately upon entering the room halted and stood looking about it in an irresolute manner. The expression of the face was, if anything, more anxious than ever, and the eyes were almost miserable in their perplexity. My companions saw me lay down my knife and fork and look towards the door with a fixed expression. "What is it, Angus?" inquired Dr. Schreiber. "It is here again," I answered, knowing that Mr. Pollard was by this time acquainted with the matter. "Where is it?" "Standing between you and the door. It looks as if it did not know where to go or what to do, or as if it was seeking somebody or something." "Watch it closely then, and tell us what happens." Then I began to report the ghost's movements to them. "It has walked over to the window and is standing there looking out into the garden. Now it has come to the hearthrug and is staring into the fire. and now it is going out of the room again. Follow it, said Dr. Schreiber. The three of us left the table and followed the ghost out of the room. This time it did not disappear. Instead, it turned to the right along the hall and went into Dr. Schreiber's study. "What is it doing?" asked the doctor when we got within. "It is standing in front of your desk, looking at your writing chair. It seems more perplexed than ever. Now it has gone round to the hearth and is looking all along the mantelpiece as if it wanted to find something. Now it's leaving the room. Follow it." The ghost went out through the hall into the garden, we three close upon its heels. It stood on the step outside the door for a moment, looking very dejected, then moved slowly away across the garden and walked round the lawn in the centre once or twice. It now slouched more than ever, and its head hung forward as if it were in trouble or pain. Suddenly it turned away by a side path towards a part of the garden given up to trees and shrubs. I described its further movements to my companions. "It is walking up that little path which leads to the summer-house. Now it has entered the summer-house. It is standing there looking just as lost, perplexed, troubled as ever. Now it... Ah! What do you see, Angus?" asked the doctor. "It has gone. Disappeared," I replied. We turned back to the house. "What do you think of that, Pollard?" said Dr. Schreiber. "Queer," replied Mr. Pollard. Nobody said anything more just then, and very soon afterwards the two doctors went out together. An hour later they returned with a carpenter and his assistant and a couple of men who looked like navvies. Dr. Schreiber asked me to come with them, and then led the way to the summer-house. When we arrived there he addressed the carpenter. "I want the floor of this place removed and the soil beneath excavated until I tell the men to stop," he said. "Do it at once." It did not take much time for the carpenter and his men to take up the floor, which was formed of squares of pine wood, easily detachable. Then the men began to dig. There is no necessity to write down the details of this gruesome search. We found the body of the young man whose ghost I had seen so many times. It was dressed just as the ghost was dressed. Gregson at once identified it as that of Everard Debenham. Dr. Schreiber has communicated with the Home Office, the police and the coroner. 8. November the 30th. The coroner's inquest is just over. The expert from the Home Office, a famous doctor, says that Everard Debenham was poisoned, and the jury have returned a verdict of wilful murder against Dr. Turrell, to whom, it seems, all General Debenham's estate was left in the event of Everard's death, if that took place previous to his marriage and the birth of children. We hear that Dr. Turrell has been arrested at Edinburgh, where he had gone to live after selling his practice to Dr. Schreiber. 9. March the 21st. Alassio, Italy. On arriving here this afternoon, we found the English newspapers and learnt from them that Dr. Turrell was hanged at Wandsworth Gaol last week, and that he left a full confession. There are also articles commenting upon the strange circumstances under which the crime was discovered, but there was nothing strange about them to me. The end. I quite like that one. Follow ghosts, everyone. They might uncover a murder. Their own murder. Right. Question is, do I want to... Yeah, I can do that one. I'd like to go straight on to the next one. Also, yes, it sounds less like a ghost and more like a cat, yeah. Just turns up, wanders around, and goes away again. Angus, what's his name? Ghost detective. I think it was Angus McIntyre. I think. But yes. Also, hello Zilia. Hope you are well. All ghosts acted like cats, just as a general rule. Yeah, it does seem to be the thing they do. It's more poltergeists, though, I feel. Just turn up, knock stuff over, make some noise. Right. Let us continue. with The Seventh Man by Sir Arthur Quiller Couch. In a one-roomed hut, high within the Arctic Circle, and only a little south of the 80th parallel, 6 men were sitting, much as they had sat evening after evening for months. They had a clock, and by it they divided the hours into day and night. As a matter of fact, it was always night, but the clock said 8:30, and they called the time evening. The hut was built of logs, with an inner skin of rough matchboarding daubed with pitch. It measured 17 feet by 14, but opposite the door 4 bunks, 2 above and 2 below, took a yard off the length, and this made the interior exactly square. Each of these bunks had 2 doors, with brass latches on the inner side, so that the owner, if he chose, could shut himself up and go to sleep in a sort of cupboard. But as a rule, he closed one of them only, that by his feet. The other swung back, with its brass latch showing. The men kept these latches in a high state of polish. Across the angle of the wall, to the left of the door, and behind it when it opened, 3 hammocks were slung, one above another. No one slept in the uppermost. But the feature of this hut was its fireplace, and this was merely a square hearthstone, raised slightly above the floor in the middle of the room. Upon it, and upon a growing mountain of soft grey ash, the fire burned always. It had no chimney, and so the men lost none of its warmth. The smoke ascended steadily and spread itself under the blackened beams and roof boards in dense blue layers. But about 18 inches beneath the spring of the roof there ran a line of small trapdoors with sliding panels, to admit the cold air, and below these the room was almost clear of smoke. A newcomer's eyes might have smarted, but these men stitched their clothes and read in comfort. To keep the updraft steady, they had plugged every chink and crevice in the matchboarding below the trapdoors with moss, and paid the seams with pitch. The fire they fed from a stack of drift and wreckwood piled to the right of the door, and fuel for the fetching strewed the frozen beach outside, whole trees notched into lengths by lumberers' axes, and washed thither from they knew not what continent. But the wreckwood came from their own ship, the J.R. McNeill, which had brought them from Dundee. They were Alexander Williamson of Dundee, better known as the Gaffer, David Fade, also of Dundee, George Lashman of Cardiff, Long Ead of Hale in Cornwall, Charles Silchester, otherwise the Snipe, of Ratcliffe Highway or thereabouts, and Daniel Cooney, shipped at Tromsø 6 weeks before the wreck, an Irish-American by birth and of no known address. The Gaffer reclined in his bunk, reading by the light of a smoky and evil-smelling lamp. He had been mate of the J.R. McNeill, and was now captain as well as patriarch of the party. He possessed 3 books, the Bible, Milton's Paradise Lost, and an odd volume of The Turkish Spy. Just now he was reading The Turkish Spy. The lamplight glinted on the rim of his spectacles and on the silvery hairs in his beard, the slack of which he had tucked under the edge of his blanket. His lips moved as he read, and now and then he broke off to glance mildly at Fade and the Snipe, who were busy beside the fire with a greasy pack of cards, or to listen to the peevish grumbling of Lashman in the bunk below him. Lashman had taken to his bed 6 weeks before with scurvy, and complained incessantly, and, though they hardly knew it, these complaints were wearing his comrades' nerves to fiddle-strings, doing the mischief that cold and bitter hard work and the cruel loneliness had hitherto failed to do. Long Ead lay stretched by the fire in a bundle of skins, reading in his only book, the Bible, open now at the Song of Solomon. Cooney had finished patching a pair of trousers and rolled himself in his hammock, whence he stared at the roof and the moonlight streaming up there through the little trapdoors and chivying the layers of smoke. Whenever Lashman broke out into fresh quaverings of self-pity, Cooney's hands opened and shut again till the nails dug hard into the palm. He groaned at length, exasperated beyond endurance. "Oh, stow it, George. Hang it all, man." He checked himself, sharp and short, repentant and rebuked by the silence of the others. They were good seamen all, and tender dealing with a sick shipmate was part of their code. Lashman's voice, more querulous than ever, cut into the silence like a knife. "That's it. You thought it for weeks, and now you say it. I've knowed all along. I'm just an encumbrance, and the sooner you're shut of me the better, says you. You needn't to fret. I'll soon be out of it. Out of it. Out there, alongside of Bill." "Easy there, matey." The snipe glanced over his shoulder and laid his cards face downward. "Here, let me give the bed a shake up. It'll ease you." "It'll make me quiet, you mean? Plucky deal you care about easing me, any of you." "Get out with your nonsense. Dan didn't mean it." The snipe slipped an arm under the invalid's head and rearranged the pillow of skins and gunny bags. "He didn't, did he? Let him say it, then." The gaffer read on, his lips moving silently. Heaven knows how he had acquired this strayed and Heaven knows how he had acquired this strayed and stained and filthy little demi-octavo with the arms of Soamerez on its bookplate, the 6th volume of letters writ by a Turkish spy who lived 45 years undiscovered at Paris, giving an impartial account to the Divan at Constantinople of the most remarkable transactions of Europe, and discovering several intrigues and secrets of the Christian courts, especially that of France, etc., etc., written originally in Arabic, translated into Italian, and from thence into English by the translator of the 1st volume. The 11th edition, London, printed for G. Strahan, S. Ballard, and a score of booksellers. Heaven knows why he read it, since he understood about 1/2 and admired less than 1/10. The Oriental reflection struck him as mainly blasphemous. But the gaffer's religious belief marked down 9/10 of mankind for perdition, which perhaps made him tolerant. At any rate, he read on gravely between the puffs of his short clay. "On the 19th of this moon, the king and the whole court were present at a ballet representing the grandeur of the French monarchy. About the middle of the entertainment there was an antique dance performed by 12 masqueraders in the supposed form of demons. But before they advanced far in their dance, they found an interloper amongst them, who, by increasing the number to 13, put them quite out of their measure, for they practised every step and motion beforehand till they are perfect. Being abashed, therefore, at the unavoidable blunders the 13th antique made them commit, they stood still like fools, gazing at one another, none daring to unmask or speak a word, for that would have put all the spectators into a disorder and confusion. Cardinal Mazarini, who was the chief contriver of these entertainments to divert the king from more serious thoughts, stood close by the young monarch, with the scheme of the ballet in his hand. Knowing, therefore, that this dance was to consist but of 12 antiques, and taking notice that there were actually 13, he at first imputed it to some mistake. But afterwards, when he perceived the confusion of the dancers, he made a more narrow inquiry into the cause of this disorder. To be brief, they convinced the cardinal that it could be no error of theirs, by a kind of demonstration, in that they had but 12 antique dresses of that sort, which were made on purpose for this particular ballet. That which made it seem the greater mystery was, that when they came behind the scenes to uncase and examine the matter, they found but 12 antiques, whereas on the stage there were 13. "Let him say it! Let him say he didn't mean it, the rotten Irishman!" Cooney flung a leg wearily over the side of his hammock, jerked himself out, and shuffled across to the sick man's berth. "Of course I didn't mean it. It just took me, you see, lying up yonder and hugging my thoughts in this wilderness. I swear to you, George, and you just wet your throat to show there's no bad blood and that you believe me." He took up a pannikin from the floor beside the bunk, pulled a hot iron from the fire, and stirred the frozen drink. The invalid turned his shoulder pettishly. "I didn't mean it," Cooney repeated. He set down the pannikin and shuffled wearily back to his hammock. The gaffer blew a long cloud and stared at the fire, at the smoke mounting and the grey ash dropping, at David Fade dealing the cards and licking his thumb between each. Long Eade shifted from one cramped elbow to another and pushed his Bible near the blaze, murmuring, "Take us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil our vines." "Full hand," the snipe announced. "Aye." David Fade rolled the quid in his cheek. The cards were so thumbed and tattered that by the backs of them each player guessed pretty shrewdly what the other held. Yet they went on playing night after night, the snipe shrilly blessing or cursing his luck, the Scotsman phlegmatic as a bolster. "Play away, man. What ails ye?" he asked. The snipe had dropped both hands to his thighs and sat up, stiff and listening. "Whist! Outside the door." All listened. "I hear nothing," said David after 10 seconds. "Hush, man, listen! There again!" They heard now. Cooney slipped down from his hammock, stole to the door and listened, crouching, with his ear close to the jamb. The sound resembled breathing, or so he thought for a moment. Then it seemed rather as if some creature was softly feeling about the door, fumbling its coating of ice and frozen snow. Cooney listened. They all listened. Usually, as soon as they stirred from the scorching circle of the fire, their breath came from them in clouds. It trickled from them now in thin wisps of vapour. They could almost hear the soft grey ash dropping on the hearth. A log spluttered. Then the invalid's voice clattered in. "It's the bears! The bears! They've come after Bill, and next it'll be my turn. I warned you. I told you he wasn't deep enough. Oh, Lord, have mercy! Mercy!" He pattered off into a prayer, his voice and teeth chattering. "Hush!" commanded the gaffer gently, and Lashman choked on a sob. "It ain't bears," Cooney reported, still with his ear to the door. "Leastways, we've had bears before. The foxes, maybe. Let me listen." Long Eade murmured, "Take us the foxes, the little foxes." "I believe you're right," the gaffer announced cheerfully. "A bear would sniff louder, though there's no telling. The snow was falling an hour back, and I dare say it is pretty thick outside. If it is a bear, we don't want him fooling on the roof, and I misdoubt the drift by the north corner is pretty tall by this time. Is he there still?" "I felt something then, through the chink here, like a warm breath. It's gone now. Come here, Snipe, and listen." "Breath, eh? Did it smell like bear?" "I don't know, I didn't smell nothing to notice. Here, put your head down, close." The snipe bent his head. And at that moment the door shook gently. All stared and saw the latch move up, and falteringly descend on the staple. They heard the click of it. The door was secured within by 2 stout bars. Against these there had been no pressure. The men waited in a silence that ached, but the latch was not lifted again. The snipe, kneeling, looked up at Cooney. Cooney shivered and looked at David Fade. Long Eade, with his back to the fire, softly shook his feet free of the rugs. His eyes searched for the gaffer's face. But the old man had drawn back into the gloom of his bunk, and the lamplight shone only on a grey fringe of beard. He saw Long Eade's look, though, and answered it quietly as ever. "Take a brace of guns aloft, and fetch us a look around. Wait if there's a chance of a shot. The trap works. I tried it this afternoon with the small chisel. Longheed lit his pipe, tied down the earpieces of his cap, lifted a light ladder off its staples and set it against a roof beam. Then, with the guns under his arm, quietly mounted. His head and shoulders wavered and grew vague to sight in the smoke wreaths. "Heard anything more?" he answered. "Nothing since," answered the snipe. With his shoulder, Longheed pushed up the trap. They saw his head framed in a panel of moonlight, with one frosty star above it. He was wriggling through. "Pitch him up a sleeping bag, somebody," the gaffer ordered, and Cooney ran with one. "Thank ye, mate," said Longheed, and closed the trap. They heard his feet stealthily crunching the frozen stuff across the roof. He was working towards the eaves overlapping the door. Their breath tightened. They waited for the explosion of his gun. None came. The crunching began again. It was heard down by the very edge of the eaves. It mounted to the blunt ridge overhead. Then it ceased. "He will not have seen aught," David Fade muttered. Listen by the door again." They talked in whispers. Nothing. There was nothing to be heard. They crept back to the fire and stood there warming themselves, keeping their eyes on the latch. It did not move. After a while, Cooney slipped off to his hammock, Fade to his bunk alongside Lashman's. The gaffer had picked up his book again. The snipe laid a couple of logs on the blaze and remained beside it, cowering with his arms stretched out as if to embrace it. His shapeless shadow wavered up and down on the bunks behind him, and across the fire he still stared at the latch. Suddenly the sick man's voice quavered out. "It's not him they want. It's Bill. They're after Bill out there. That was Bill trying to get in. Why didn't you open? It was Bill, I tell you." At the first word, the snipe had wheeled right about face and stood now, pointing and shaking like a man with ague. "Matey, for the love of God!" "I won't hush. There's something wrong here tonight. I can't sleep. It's Bill, I tell you. See his poor hammock up there shaking." Cooney tumbled out with an oath and a thud. "Hush it, you white-livered swine! Hush it, or by—" His hand went behind him to his knife sheath. "Dan Cooney." The gaffer closed his book and leaned out. "Go back to your bed." "I won't, sir. Not unless—" "Go back. Flesh and blood. Go back." And for the third time that night, Cooney went back. The gaffer leaned a little farther over the ledge, and addressed the sick man. "George, I went to Bill's grave not 6 hours agone. The snow on it wasn't even disturbed. Neither beast nor man, but only God can break up the hard earth he lies under. I tell you that, and you may lay to it. Now go to sleep." Longheed crouched on the frozen ridge of the hut, with his feet in the sleeping bag, his knees drawn up, and the two guns laid across them. The creature, whatever its name, that had tried the door, was nowhere to be seen, but he decided to wait a few minutes on the chance of a shot, that is, until the cold should drive him below. For the moment, the clear, tingling air was doing him good. The truth was, Longheed had begun to be afraid of himself, and the way his mind had been running for the last 48 hours upon green fields and visions of spring. As he put it to himself, something inside his head was melting. Biblical texts chattered within him like running brooks, and as they fleeted he could almost smell the blown meadow scent. "Take us the foxes, the little foxes, for our vines have tender grapes, a fountain of gardens, a well of living waters, and streams from Lebanon. Awake, O north wind, and come, thou south, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out." He was light-headed, and he knew it. He must hold out. They were all going mad. Were, in fact, 3 parts crazed already, all except the gaffer. And the gaffer relied on him as his right-hand man. One glimpse of the returning sun, one glimpse only, might save them yet. He gazed out over the frozen hills and northward across the ice pack. A few streaks of pale violet, the ghost of the aurora, fronted the moon. He could see for miles. Bear or fox, no living creature was in sight. But who could tell what might be hiding behind any one of 1,000 hummocks? He listened. He heard the slow grinding of the ice pack off the beach. Only that. Take us the foxes, the little foxes. This would never do. He must climb down and walk briskly, or return to the hut. Maybe there was a bear after all behind one of the hummocks, and a shot, or the chance of one, would scatter his head clear of these tomfooling notions. He would have a search around. What was that moving on a hummock not 500 yards away? He leaned forward to gaze. Nothing now, but he had seen something. He lowered himself to the eaves by the north corner, and from the eaves to the drift piled there. The drift was frozen solid, but for a treacherous crust of fresh snow. His foot slipped upon this, and down he slid of a heap. Luckily he had been careful to sling the guns tightly at his back. He picked himself up, and unstrapping one, took a step into the bright moonlight to examine the humps. Took 2 steps, and stood stock still. There, before him, on the frozen coat of snow, was a footprint. No, 2, 3, 4, many footprints. Prints of a naked human foot. Right foot, left foot, both naked, and blood in each print, a little smear. It had come, then. He was mad for certain. He saw them. He put his fingers in them, touched the frozen blood. The snow before the door was trodden thick with them, some going, some returning. The latch lifted. Suddenly he recalled the figure he had seen moving upon the hummock, and with a groan he set his face northward and gave chase. Oh, he was mad for certain. He ran like a madman, floundering, slipping, plunging in his clumsy moccasins. Take us the foxes, the little foxes. My beloved put his hand by the hole of the door, and my bowels were moved for him. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, I charge you. He ran thus for 300 yards, maybe, and stopped as suddenly as he had started. His mates, they must not see these footprints, or they would go mad too, mad as he. No, he must cover them up, all within sight of the hut, and tomorrow he would come alone and cover those farther afield. Slowly he retraced his steps. The footprints, those which pointed towards the hut and those which pointed away from it, lay close together, and he knelt before each, breaking fresh snow over the hollows and carefully hiding the blood. And now a great happiness filled his heart, interrupted once or twice as he worked by a feeling that someone was following and watching him. Once he turned northwards and gazed, making a telescope of his hands. He saw nothing, and fell again to his long task. Within the hut the sick man cried softly to himself. Fade, the snipe, and Cooney slept uneasily and muttered in their dreams. The gaffer lay awake, thinking. After Bill, George Lashman, and after George, who next? And who would be the last, the unburied one? The men were weakening fast, their wits and courage coming down at the end with a rush. Fade and Long Ead were the only 2 to be depended on for a day. The gaffer liked Long Ead, who was a religious man. Indeed, he had a growing suspicion that Long Ead, in spite of some amiable laxities of belief, was numbered among the elect, or might be if interceded for. The gaffer began to intercede for him silently, but experience had taught him that such wrestlings, to be effective, must be noisy, and he dropped off to sleep with a sense of failure. The snipe stretched himself, yawned, and awoke. It was 7 in the morning. Time to prepare a cup of tea. He tossed an armful of logs onto the fire, and the noise awoke the gaffer, who at once inquired for Long Ead. He had not returned. "Go you up to the roof. The lad must be frozen." The snipe climbed the ladder, pushed open the trap, and came back, reporting that Long Ead was nowhere to be seen. The old man slipped a jumper over his suits of clothing, already 3 deep, reached for a gun, and moved to the door. "Take a cup of something warm to fortify," the snipe advised. "The kettle won't be 5 minutes boiling." But the gaffer pushed up the heavy bolts and dragged the door open. "What in the... Here, bear a hand, lads!" Long Ead lay prone before the threshold, his outstretched hands almost touching it, his moccasins already covered out of sight by the powdery snow which ran and trickled incessantly, trickled between his long dishevelled locks and over the back of his gloves, and ran in a thin stream past the gaffer's feet. They carried him in and laid him on a heap of skins by the fire. They forced rum between his clenched teeth, and beat his hands and feet, and kneaded and rubbed him. A sigh fluttered on his lips, something between a sigh and a smile, half seen, half heard. His eyes opened, and his comrade saw that it was really a smile. I seen... The voice broke off, but he was smiling still. What had he seen? Not the sun, surely. By the gaffer's reckoning, the sun would not be due for a week or 2 yet. How many weeks he could not say precisely, and sometimes he was glad enough that he did not know. They forced him to drink a couple of spoonfuls of rum, and wrapped him up warmly. Each man contributed some of his own bedding. Then the gaffer called to morning prayers, and the 3 sound men dropped on their knees with him. Now, whether by reason of their joy at Long Ead's recovery, or because the old man was in splendid voice, they felt their hearts uplifted that morning with a cheerfulness they had not known for months. Long Ead lay and listened dreamily while the passion of the gaffer's thanksgiving shook the hut. His gaze wandered over their bowed forms. The gaffer, David Fade, Dan Cooney, the snipe, and George Lashman in his bunk, of course, and me. But then, who was the 7th? He began to count. There's myself, Lashman in his bunk, David Fade, the gaffer, the snipe, Dan Cooney, 1, 2, 3, 4... Well, but that made 7. Then who was the 7th? Was it George, who had crawled out of bed and was kneeling there? Decidedly there were 5 kneeling. No, there was George, plain enough, in his berth, and not able to move. Then who was the stranger? Wrong again. There was no stranger. He knew all these men, they were his mates. Was it Bill? No. Bill was dead and buried. None of these was Bill or like Bill. Try again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5... and us 2 sick men, 7. The gaffer, David Fade, Dan Cooney. Have I counted Dan twice? No, that's Dan, yonder to the right, and only one of him. 5 men kneeling and 2 on their backs. That makes 7 every time. Dear God, suppose... The gaffer ceased, and in the act of rising from his knees, caught sight of Long Ead's face. While the others fetched their breakfast cans, he stepped over and bent and whispered, "Tell me, you've seen what?" "Seen?" Long Ead echoed. "Aye, seen what? Speak low. Was it the sun?" But this time the echo died on his lips. and his face grew full of awe uncomprehending. It frightened the gaffer. "You'll be the better of a snatch of sleep," said he, and was turning to go, when Long Ead stirred a hand under the edge of his rugs. 7. Count, he whispered. "Lord have mercy on us," the gaffer muttered into his beard as he moved away. Long Ead gone crazed. And yet, though an hour or two ago this had been the worst that could befall, the gaffer felt unusually cheerful. As for the others, they were like different men all that day and through the 3 days that followed. Even Lashman ceased to complain, and, unless their eyes played them a trick, had taken a turn for the better. "I declare if I don't feel like pitching to sing," the snipe announced on the second evening, as much to his own wonder as to theirs. "Then why in thunder don't you strike up?" answered Dan Cooney, and fetched his concertina. The snipe struck up then and there. What is more, the gaffer looked up from his Paradise Lost and joined in the chorus. By the end of the second day, Long Ead was up and active again. He went about with a dazed look in his eyes. He was counting to himself, always counting. The gaffer watched him furtively. Since his recovery, though his lips moved frequently, Long Ead had scarcely uttered a word. But towards noon on the 4th day, he said an extraordinary thing. "There's that sleeping bag I took with me the other night. I wonder if 'tis on the roof still. It will be froze pretty stiff by this. You might nip up and see, Snipe, and—" He paused. "If you find it, stow it up yonder on Bill's hammock." The gaffer opened his mouth, but shut it again without speaking. The snipe went up the ladder. A minute passed, and then they heard a cry from the roof, a cry that fetched them all trembling, choking, weeping, cheering to the foot of the ladder. "Boys! Boys! The sun!" Months later, it was June, and even George Lashman had recovered his strength. The snipe came running with news of the whaling fleet. And on the beach, as they watched the vessels come to anchor, Long Ead told the gaffer his story. "It was what d'you call it? I reckon I was crazed, eh?" The gaffer's eyes wandered from a brambling hopping about the lichen-covered boulders and away to the seafowl wheeling above the ships, and then came into his mind a tale he had read once in the Turkish Spy. "I wouldn't say just that," he answered slowly. "Anyway," said Long Ead, "I believe that the Lord sent a miracle to save us all." "I wouldn't say just that either," the gaffer objected. "I doubt it was meant just for you and me, and the rest were preserved, as you might say, incidentally." The end. That's another quite fun one. I like that. You're not quite sure whether it was a ghost or not, and why there was a 7th person there, and why only some people saw it, and etc. And I just spilled water on my desk. So I'm going to go to a break. Everybody do break-related things. Have a good break. And you did or ghosted. No, definitely me. Yes, go have a good break, and we shall see you in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. And we are back. I hope you've all had a good break. I have made myself a cup of tea. I hope you have all done break-related things. And are ready for some more spooky stories. Yes, I do apologise for my accents in that last one. It was this kind of thing of, well, there are lots of names and I can't remember... Punch my mic, sorry. I can't remember who's come from where. But this is very obviously written in a kind of Irish attempt at an Irish accent. But also I think this was the guy who said that they were American Irish, so I have no idea what accent to do for this. So it was just my attempt at trying to make everybody's voice a little bit different, but when you've got like 5 characters, it's a little bit hard to do that. So I probably should have written a list down and said which one had which accent, but you know, I realised one of them was meant to be Scottish. I don't know which one it was, but you know. Anyway, let us continue, shall we? Yeah, I've got two more stories loaded, as it were. But we shall see whether we have time for both of them. Sounded good to your ignorant American ears. Good, I'm glad. Just make everyone either Cockney or vaguely Northern. Yeah, or West Country. The trifecta of accents: Cockney, Northern, West Country. OR. Yeah, that's usually the easy ones to do. So the next one we've got is an H.G. Wells one. Because apparently H.G. Wells also had a bash at writing ghost stories. Seems that every author has had a go at writing ghost stories. Your full regional accent repertoire, yeah, kind of the same really. I can't really do much more than that. But oh well, it's probably a good thing. It means they're not insulting too many people. Sorry for ruining your accents. But yes, let's continue with some more spooky stories. It's not like the 80s when rap got big and everyone had to do rap, but for old white men in suits. Yeah, exactly. But yes, we continue with The Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells. The scene amidst which Clayton told his story comes back very vividly to my mind. There he sat, for the greater part of the time, in the corner of the authentic settle by the spacious open fire, and Sanderson sat beside him, smoking the Broseley clay that bore his name. There was Evans, and that marvel among actors, Wish, who was also a modest man. We had all come down to the Mermaid Club that Saturday morning, except Clayton, who had slept there overnight, which indeed gave him the opening of his story. We had golfed until golfing was invisible. We had dined, and we were in that mood of tranquil kindliness when men will suffer a story. When Clayton began to tell one, we naturally supposed that he was lying. It may be that indeed he was lying. Of that the reader will speedily be able to judge as well as I. He began, it is true, with an air of matter-of-fact anecdote, but that we thought was only the incurable artifice of the man. "I say," he remarked, after a long consideration of the upward rain of sparks from the log that Sanderson had thumped, "you know I was alone here last night?" "Except for the domestics," said Wish. "Who sleep in the other wing," said Clayton. "Yes, well..." He pulled at his cigar for some little time, as though he still hesitated about his confidence. Then he said, quite quietly, "I caught a ghost." "Caught a ghost, did you?" said Sanderson. "Where is it?" And Evans, who admires Clayton immensely and has been 4 weeks in America, shouted, "Caught a ghost, did you, Clayton? I'm glad of it. Tell us all about it right now." Clayton said he would in a minute, and asked him to shut the door. He looked apologetically at me. "There's no eavesdropping, of course, but we don't want to upset our very excellent service with any rumours of ghosts in the place. There's too much shadow and oak panelling to trifle with that. And this, you know, wasn't a regular ghost. I don't think it will come again, ever." "You mean to say you didn't keep it?" said Sanderson. "I hadn't the heart to," said Clayton, and Sanderson said he was surprised. We laughed, and Clayton looked aggrieved. "I know," he said, with a flicker of a smile, "but the fact is, it really was a ghost, and I'm as sure of it as I am that I'm talking to you now. I'm not joking. I mean what I say." Sanderson drew deeply at his pipe, with one reddish eye on Clayton, and then emitted a thin jet of smoke more eloquent than many words. Clayton ignored the comment. "It is the strangest thing that has ever happened in my life. You know, I never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort before, ever. And then, you know, I bag one in a corner and the whole business is in my hands." He meditated still more profoundly, and produced and began to pierce a second cigar with a curious little stabber he affected. "You talked to it?" asked Wish. "For the space, probably, of an hour." "Chatty?" I said, joining the party of the sceptics. "The poor devil was in trouble," said Clayton, bowed over his cigar end and with the very faintest note of reproof. "Sobbing?" someone asked. Clayton heaved a realistic sigh at the memory. "Good Lord," he said, "yes." And then, "Poor fellow, yes." "Where did you strike it?" asked Evans in his best American accent. "I never realised," said Clayton, ignoring him, "the poor sort of thing a ghost might be." And he hung us up again for a time, while he sought for matches in his pocket and lit and warmed to his cigar. "I took an advantage," he reflected at last. We were none of us in a hurry. "A character," he said, "remains just the same character for all that it's been disembodied. That's a thing we too often forget. People with a certain strength or fixity of purpose may have ghosts of a certain strength and fixity of purpose. Most haunting ghosts, you know, must be as one-idea'd as monomaniacs and as obstinate as mules to come back again and again. This poor creature wasn't." He suddenly looked up rather queerly, and his eye went round the room. "I say it," he said, "in all kindliness, but that is the plain truth of the case. Even at the first glance he struck me as weak." He punctuated with the help of his cigar. "I came upon him, you know, in the long passage. His back was towards me, and I saw him first. Right off I knew him for a ghost. He was transparent and whitish. Clean through his chest I could see the glimmer of the little window at the end. And not only his physique, but his attitude struck me as being weak. He looked, you know, as though he didn't know in the slightest whatever he meant to do. One hand was on the panelling and the other fluttered to his mouth, like so." "What sort of physique?" said Sanderson. "Lean. You know that sort of young man's neck that has two great flutings down the back, here and here, so, and a little meanish head with scrubby hair and rather bad ears. Shoulders bad, narrower than the hips, turn-down collar, ready-made short jacket, trousers baggy and a little frayed at the heels. That's how he took me. I came very quietly up the staircase. I did not carry a light, you know. The candles are on the landing table and there is that lamp. And I was in my list slippers and I saw him as I came up. I stopped dead at that, taking him in. I wasn't a bit afraid. I think that in most of these affairs one is never nearly so afraid or excited as one imagines one would be. I was surprised and interested. I thought, good Lord, here's a ghost at last. and I haven't believed for a moment in ghosts during the last 25 years. Said Wish. I suppose I wasn't on the landing a moment before he found out I was there. He turned on me sharply, and I saw the face of an immature young man, a weak nose, a scrubby little moustache, a feeble chin. So for an instant we stood, he looking over his shoulder at me, and regarded one another. Then he seemed to remember his high calling. He turned round, drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, spread his hands in approved ghost fashion, came towards me. As he did so, his little jaw dropped, and he emitted a faint, drawn-out boo. No, it wasn't, not a bit dreadful. I'd dined, I'd had a bottle of champagne, and being all alone, perhaps 2 or 3, well, perhaps even 4 or 5 whiskies, so I was as solid as rocks and no more frightened than if I'd been assailed by a frog. "Boo," I said. "Nonsense. You don't belong to this place. What are you doing here?" I could see him wince. "Boo," he said. "Boo be hanged, are you a member?" I said, and just to show I didn't care a pin for him, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. "Are you a member?" I repeated, looking at him sideways. He moved a little so as to stand clear of me, and his bearing became crestfallen. "No," he said in answer to the persistent interrogation of my eye. "I'm not a member. I'm a ghost." "Well, that doesn't give you the run of the Mermaid Club. Is there anyone you want to see, or anything of that sort?" And doing it as steadily as possible for fear that he should mistake the carelessness of whisky for the distraction of fear, I got my candle alight. I turned on him, holding it. "What are you doing here?" I said. He had dropped his hands and stopped his booing, and there he stood, abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, silly, aimless young man. "I'm haunting," he said. "You haven't any business to," I said in a quiet voice. "I'm a ghost," he said, as if in defence. "That may be, but you haven't any business to haunt here. This is a respectable private club. People often stop here with nursemaids and children, and going about in the careless way you do, some poor little mite could easily come upon you and be scared out of her wits. I suppose you didn't think of that?" "No, sir," he said, "I didn't." "You should have done. You haven't any claim on the place, have you? Weren't murdered here or anything of that sort?" "None, sir, but I thought as it was old and oak-panelled." "That's no excuse." I regarded him firmly. "Your coming here is a mistake," I said in a tone of friendly superiority. I feigned to see if I had my matches, and then looked up at him frankly. "If I were you, I wouldn't wait for cockcrow. I'd vanish right away." He looked embarrassed. "The fact is, sir," he began. "I'd vanish," I said, driving it home. "The fact is, sir, that somehow I can't." "You can't?" "No, sir. There's something I've forgotten. I have been hanging about here since midnight last night, hiding in the cupboards of the empty bedrooms and things like that. I'm flurried. I've never come haunting before, and it seems to put me out." "Put you out?" Yes, sir. I've tried to do it several times, and it doesn't come off. There's some little thing that has slipped me, and I can't get back." That, rather bowled me over. He looked at me in such an abject way that for the life of me I couldn't keep up quite the high hectoring vein I had adopted. "That's queer," I said, and as I spoke I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. "Come into my room and tell me more about it," I said. I didn't, of course, understand this, and tried to take him by the arm. But, of course, you might as well have tried to take hold of a puff of smoke. I had forgotten my number, I think. Anyhow, I remember going into several bedrooms. It was lucky I was the only soul in that wing, until I saw my traps. "Here we are," I said, and sat down in the armchair. "Sit down and tell me all about it. It seems to me you have got yourself into a jolly awkward position, old chap." Well, he said he wouldn't sit down. He'd prefer to flit up and down the room if it was all the same to me. And so he did, and in a little while we were deep in a long and serious talk. And presently, something of those whiskies and sodas evaporated out of me, and I began to realise just a little what a thundering rum and weird business it was that I was in. There he was, semi-transparent, the proper conventional phantom, and noiseless except for his ghost of a voice, flitting to and fro in that nice, clean, chintz-hung old bedroom. You could see the gleam of the copper candlesticks through him, and the lights on the brass fender, and the corners of the framed engravings on the wall. And there he was, telling me all about this wretched little life of his that had recently ended on earth. He hadn't a particularly honest face, but being transparent, of course, he couldn't avoid telling the truth. "Eh?" said Wish, suddenly sitting up in his chair. "What?" said Clayton. "Being transparent couldn't avoid telling the truth. I don't see it," said Wish. "I don't see it," said Clayton with inimitable assurance. "But it is so, I can assure you, nevertheless. I don't believe he got once a nail's breadth off the Bible truth. He told me how he had been killed. He went down into a London basement with a candle to look for a leakage of gas, and described himself as a senior English master in a London private school when that release occurred." "Poor wretch," said I. "That's what I thought, and the more he talked, the more I thought it. There he was, purposeless in life and purposeless out of it. He talked of his father and mother and his schoolmaster, and all who had ever been anything to him in the world, meanly. He had been too sensitive, too nervous. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He never had a real friend in the world, I think. He had never had a success. He had shirked games and failed examinations. "It's like that with some people," he said. "Whenever I got into the examination room or anywhere, everything seemed to go. Engaged to be married, of course, to another oversensitive person, I suppose, when the indiscretion with the gas escape ended his affairs." "And where are you now?" I asked. "Not in—" He wasn't clear on that point at all. The impression he gave me was of a sort of vague intermediate state, a special reserve for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin or virtue. I don't know. He was much too egotistical and unobservant to give me any clear idea of the kind of place, kind of country there is on the other side of things. Wherever he was, he seems to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of weak Cockney young men, those who were on a footing of Christian names, and among these there was certainly a lot of talk about going haunting and things like that. Yes, going haunting. They seemed to think haunting a tremendous adventure, and most of them funked it all the time. And so primed, he'd come. "But really," said Wish to the fire. "These are the impressions he gave me, anyhow," said Clayton modestly. "I may, of course, have been in a rather uncritical state, but that was the sort of background he gave to himself. He kept flitting up and down with his thin voice going, talking about his wretched self, and never a word of clear, firm statement from first to last. He was thinner and sillier and more pointless than if he had been real and alive. Only then, he would not have been in my bedroom here. If he had been alive, I should have kicked him out." "Of course," said Evans, "there are poor mortals like that. And there's just as much chance of their having ghosts as the rest of us," I admitted. "What gave a sort of point to him, was the fact that he did seem within limits to have found himself out. The mess he had made of haunting had depressed him terribly. He had been told it would be a lark. He had come expecting it to be a lark, and here it was, nothing but another failure added to his record. He proclaimed himself an utter out-and-out failure. He said, and I can quite believe it, that he had never tried to do anything all his life that he hadn't made a perfect mess of. And through all the wastes of eternity he never would. If he had had sympathy, perhaps. He paused at that, and stood regarding me. He remarked that, strange as it might seem to me, nobody, not anyone, had ever given him the amount of sympathy I was doing now. I could see what he wanted straight away, and I determined to head him off at once. I may be a brute, you know, but being the only real friend, the recipient of the confidences of one of these egotistical weaklings, ghost or body, is beyond my physical endurance. I got up briskly. "Don't you brood on these things too much," I said. "The thing you've got to do is to get out of this. Get out of this sharp. You pull yourself together and try." "I can't," he said. "You try," I said, and try he did. "Try?" said Sanderson. "How?" "Passes," said Clayton. "Passes?" Complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands. That's how he had come in, and that's how he had to get out again. Lord, what a business I had. "But how could any series of passes—" I began. "My dear man," said Clayton, turning on me and putting a great emphasis on certain words. "You want everything clear. I don't know how. All I know is that you do. That he did, anyhow, at least. After a fearful time, you know, he got his passes right and suddenly disappeared." "Did you," said Sanderson slowly, "observe the passes?" "Yes," said Clayton, and seemed to think. "It was tremendously queer," he said. "There we were, I and this thin, vague ghost in that silent room, in this silent, empty inn, in this silent little Friday night town. Not a sound except our voices and the faint panting he made when he swung. There was the bedroom candle, and one candle on the dressing table alight, that was all. Sometimes one or other would flare up into a tall, lean, astonished flame for a space. And queer things happened. 'I can't,' he said, 'I shall never.' And suddenly he sat down on a little chair at the foot of the bed and began to sob and sob. Lord, what a harrowing, whimpering thing he seemed. 'You pull yourself together,' I said, and tried to pat him on the back, and my confounded hand went through him. By that time, you know, I wasn't nearly so massive as I had been on the landing. I got the queerness of it full. I remember snatching back my hand out of him, as it were, with a little thrill, and walking over to the dressing table. 'You pull yourself together,' I said to him, 'and try.' And in order to encourage and help him, I began to try as well." "What?" said Sanderson. "The passes?" "Yes, the passes." "But," I said, moved by an idea that eluded me for a space. "This is interesting," said Sanderson, with his finger in his pipe bowl. "You mean to say this ghost of yours did his level best to give away the whole confounded barrier? Yes." "He didn't," said Wish. "He couldn't, or you'd have gone there too." "That's precisely it," I said, finding my elusive idea put into words for me. "That is precisely it," said Clayton, with thoughtful eyes upon the fire. For just a little while there was silence. "And at last he did it?" said Sanderson. "At last he did it. I had to keep him up to it hard, but he did it at last, rather suddenly. He despaired, we had a scene, and then he got up abruptly and asked me to go through the whole performance slowly so that he might see. I believe, he said, if I could see, I should spot what was wrong at once. And he did. I know, he said. "What do you know?" said I. "I know," he repeated. Then he said peevishly, "I can't do it if you look at me. I really can't. It's been that partly all along. I'm such a nervous fellow that you put me out." Well, we had a bit of an argument. Naturally, I wanted to see, but he was as obstinate as a mule, and suddenly I had come over as tired as a dog. He'd tired me out. "All right," I said, "I won't look at you," and turned towards the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. He started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the looking-glass to see just what it was had hung. Round went his arms and his hands, so, and so, and so, and then with a rush came to the last gesture of all. "You stand tall and open out your arms." And so, don't you know, he stood. And then he didn't. He wasn't. I wheeled round from the looking-glass to him. There was nothing. I was alone with the flaring candles and a staggering mind. What had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality about it, the clock upon the landing discovered the moment was ripe for striking 1. So, ping, and I was as grave and sober as a judge, with all my champagne and whisky gone into the vast serene. Feeling queer, you know, confoundedly queer. Good Lord. He regarded his cigar ash for a moment. "That's all that happened," he said. "And then you went to bed?" asked Evans. "What else was there to do?" I looked Wish in the eye. We wanted to scoff, and there was something perhaps in Clayton's voice and manner that hampered our desire. "And about these passes," said Sanderson. "I believe I could do them now." "Oh," said Sanderson, and produced a penknife and set himself to grub the dottle out of the bowl of his clay. "Why don't you do them now?" said Sanderson, shutting his penknife with a click. "That's what I'm going to do," said Clayton. "They won't work," said Evans. "If they do," I suggested. "You know, I'd rather you didn't," said Wish, stretching out his legs. "Why?" asked Evans. "I'd rather he didn't," said Wish. "But he hasn't got 'em right," said Sanderson, plugging too much tobacco into his pipe. "All the same, I'd rather he didn't," said Wish. We argued with Wish. He said that for Clayton to go through these gestures was like mocking a serious matter. "But you don't believe—" I said. Wish glanced at Clayton, who was staring into the fire, weighing something in his mind. "I do. More than half, anyhow, I do," said Wish. "Clayton," said I, "you're too good a liar for us. Most of it was all right, but that disappearance happened to be convincing. Tell us it's a tale of cock and bull." He stood up without heeding me, took the middle of the hearthrug and faced me. For a moment he regarded his feet thoughtfully, and then for all the rest of the time his eyes were on the opposite wall with an intent expression. He raised his 2 hands slowly to the level of his eyes, and so began. "Now, Sanderson is a Freemason, a member of the Lodge of the Four Kings, which devotes itself so ably to the study and elucidation of all the mysteries of masonry past and present, and among the students of this lodge Sanderson is by no means the least." He followed Clayton's motions with a singular interest in his reddish eye. "That's not bad," he said when it was done. "You really do, you know, put things together, Clayton, in a most amazing fashion. But there's one little detail out." "I know," said Clayton. "I believe I could tell you which." "Well?" "This," said Clayton, and did a strange little twist and writhing and thrust of the hands. "Yes." "That, you know, was what he couldn't get right," said Clayton. "But how do you—" "Most of this business, and Particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all, said Sanderson. But just that phase, I do, he reflected. These happen to be a series of gestures connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry, probably you know, or else how? He reflected still further. I do not see I can do any harm in telling you just the proper twist. After all, if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. I know nothing, said Clayton, except what the poor devil let out last night. Well, anyhow, said Sanderson, and placed his churchwarden very carefully upon the shelf over the fireplace. Then very rapidly he gesticulated with his hands. So, said Clayton, repeating. So, said Sanderson, and took his pipe in hand again. Ah, now, said Clayton, I can do the whole thing. Right. He stood up before the waning fire and smiled at us all. But I think there was just a little hesitation in his smile. If I begin, he said. I wouldn't begin, said Wish. It's all right, said Evans. Matter is indestructible. You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of shades? Not it. You may try, Clayton, so far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the wrists. I don't believe that, said Wish, and stood up and put his arm on Clayton's shoulder. You've made me half believe in that story somehow, and I don't want to see the thing done. Goodness, said I, is Wish frightened? I am, said Wish, with real or admirably feigned intensity. I believe that if he goes through these motions right, he'll go. He'll not do anything of the sort, I cried. There's only one way out of this world for men, and Clayton is 30 years from that. Besides, and such a ghost, do you think... Wish interrupted me by moving. He walked out from among our chairs and stopped beside the table and stood there. Clayton, he said, you're a fool. Clayton, with a humorous light in his eyes, smiled back at him. Wish, he said, is right, and all you others are wrong. I shall go. I shall get to the end of these passes, and as the last swish whistles through the air, presto, this hearthrug will be vacant, the room will be blank amazement, and a respectably dressed gentleman of 15 stone will plump into the world of shades. I'm certain. So will you be. I decline to argue further. Let the thing be tried. No, said Wish, and made a step and ceased, and Clayton raised his hands once more to repeat the spirit's passing. By that time, you know, we were all in a state of tension, largely because of the behaviour of Wish. We sat, all of us, with our eyes on Clayton, I, at least, with a sort of tight, stiff feeling about me, as though from the back of my skull to the middle of my thighs my body had been changed to steel. And there, with a gravity that was imperturbably serene, Clayton bowed and swayed and waved his hands and arms before us. As he drew towards the end, one piled up, one tingled in one's teeth. The last gesture, I have said, was to swing the arms out wide open, with the face held up. And when, at last, he swung out to this closing gesture, I ceased even to breathe. It was ridiculous, of course, but you know that ghost story feeling. It was after dinner, in a queer old shadowy house. Would he, after all... There he stood, for one stupendous moment, with his arms open and his upturned face assured and bright in the glare of the hanging lamp. We hung through that moment as if it were an age, and then came from all of us something that was half a sigh of infinite relief, and half a reassuring, no. For visibly, he wasn't going. It was all nonsense. He had told an idle story and carried it almost to conviction, that was all. And then, in that moment, the face of Clayton changed. It changed. It changed as a lit house changes when its lights are suddenly extinguished. His eyes were suddenly eyes that were fixed, his smile was frozen on his lips, and he stood there still. He stood there, very gently swaying. That moment, too, was an age. And then, chairs were scraping, things were falling, and we were all moving. His knees seemed to give, and he fell forward, and Evans rose and caught him in his arms. It stunned us all. For a minute, I suppose, no one said a coherent thing. We believed it, yet could not believe it. I came out of a muddled stupefaction to find myself kneeling beside him, and his vest and shirt were torn open, and Sanderson's hand lay on his heart. Well, the simple fact before us could very well wait our convenience. There was no hurry for us to comprehend. It lay there for an hour. It lies athwart my memory, black and amazing still to this day. Clayton had indeed passed into the world that lies so near to and so far from our own, and he had gone thither by the only road that mortal man may take. But whether he did indeed pass there by that poor ghost's incantation, or whether he was stricken suddenly by apoplexy in the midst of an idle tale, as the coroner's jury would have us believe, is no matter for my judging. It is just one of those inexplicable riddles that must remain unsolved until the final solution of all things shall come. All I certainly know is that in the very moment, in the very instant of concluding those passes, he changed and staggered and fell down before us, dead. The end.